Alright, so get this. There's a scientist that had a snowball fight with an orca. In 2009, the marine ecologist Robert L. Pittman and his team were driving through Antarctica with an icebreaker. A group of orcas learned that following the icebreaker gave them access to new feeding grounds. When one of the orcas was close enough, Robert playfully threw a snowball in its direction. In his own words,
I noticed that there was a piece of ice about the size of a basketball, and then she came up and arched her head and hit this chunk of ice and threw it several feet in the air. She spent about the next 10 minutes lofting this chunk of ice into the air right there in front of me.
Now, of course, you always have to be careful with interpreting animal behavior through a human lens, but there's definitely more to orcas' intelligence than many of us believe. Orcas have a lot of highly complex and frankly quite beautiful hunting techniques that are different depending on the specific orca population. And some of them are so beautifully coordinated that they definitely require a very high level of intelligence. You might have seen the footage of orcas creating a wave to wash a seal off its ice sheet. Absolutely horrible day to be a seal laying on an ice sheet, I'll tell you that. There's also research suggesting that orcas can recognize themselves in a mirror and probably are self-aware. On top of that, they seem to be very capable of experiencing emotions like grief, and there's a case to be made that they feel emotions on a deeper level than humans can. But more on the science behind that later. There's so much to talk about when it comes to orcas' intelligence, and in this video we'll talk about how they learn, how they interact with humans, and answer other questions like how do orcas communicate, what does their social structure look like, how intelligent are they actually, and could they be smarter than us? Orcas are toothed whales that belong to the oceanic dolphins family, and they're its largest member, basically dolphins on steroids. Over the last few decades, as research on wild orcas has expanded, scientists have described a few different types or forms of orcas. These so-called ecotypes are different populations of orcas that differ in size, appearance, prey preferences, foraging techniques, dialects, behaviors, and social groups. So basically different cultures. The ranges of these populations often overlap, but they don't seem to interbreed or even interact with the other ecotypes. This is why there's a lot of scientists that think that these ecotypes should be considered different species of orcas altogether, because they are so different from each other. But of course, deciding what actually defines a species is a problem that goes way back in biology, so as of now there's no consensus on this topic, and we still only have this one species called Orcinus orca with all of its different ecotypes. Now, I'm not gonna be able to discuss every single ecotype in this video, but we will talk about the most fascinating hunting techniques and social behaviors from these different groups, and you will quickly realize how diverse and unique they actually are. Usually though, they're divided into three main groups, which is the resident, the transient, and the offshore orcas. Orcas have very complex social structures. Only elephants and primates have comparably complex structures. They are built around long-term family units called matrilines. These consist of an eldest female orca, the matriarch, and her sons and daughters and their descendants. And honestly, this was the first bit of information that made me think that they might be smarter than us, or at least that we have a lot to learn from them. Because I don't want to get too political here, but just look at where primarily male-dominated societies and politics have gotten us. I mean, I don't see orcas destroying their environment for the benefit of a few handful of individuals. But back to the matrilines. Female orcas can live up to 90 years, so oftentimes these matrilines are made up of several generations. The bonds in these matrilines are extremely stable, so orcas rarely leave their groups, and usually they spend their entire lives with their mother. Several of these matrilines together form a pod, and these pods usually contain 5 to 20 individuals. These pods can then group together into clans, and the highest form of social structure are the communities. These communities are associations of pods and clans that share a same geographical range. They socialize and feed together, but they do not necessarily share the same maternal heritage. This complex structure allows orcas to learn and pass on knowledge through the generations. They don't really rely too much on instincts. A lot of their behavior is actually taught from a young age. Mothers actively teach their young how to hunt, communicate, and navigate their environment. I remember when I was doing a road trip in Norway, I actually came across a group of orcas that were very close to the shore in one of the fjords. And you could clearly see that there was a younger orca and several older ones, and the older ones seemed to be teaching the calf how to hunt. In this case, they were hunting a fish otter, and it looked like he was having a horrible time. And rest in peace, my dude. That must have been the most stressful last 20 minutes anyone has ever had. Over time, this sort of teaching preserves skills, strategies, and traditions for generations. And essentially, this is how the different ecotypes that I mentioned earlier are formed and maintained. I think this is a good moment to go over the most impressive hunting techniques that these different ecotypes have developed. Orcas are apex predators and have a very diverse diet, and the different ecotypes have specialized on different types of prey, including animals like sharks, rays, bony fish, seals, and even whales. Let's start with perhaps the most famous strategy, which is of course the wave washing. This technique is only used by about 100 orcas, the so-called B1 killer whales that sometimes hunt seals in the pack ice of Antarctica. To start off the hunt, they use a technique called spy hopping, where they sort of emerge vertically from the water to take a little peek above the water surface to try and spot a seal that's laying on the ice. Yeah, that's terrifying. Fuck no. Once they've spotted the prey, they form a line and charge towards the ice sheet. And just before reaching it, they rotate to their sides in a single synchronized motion and plunge underwater. The momentum creates a wave that can wash the seal off its protective ice floe, and sometimes they also create strong underwater waves which can destroy the ice sheets and break it off into several smaller floes. Don't look at me for help. This behavior is not inert, and it is clear that this is learned and then passed on through the generations, like I mentioned earlier. But as Antarctica warms and sea ice vanishes, a lot of seals stay on land where orcas can't reach them. Scientists found that B1 killer whales are losing about 5% of their population each year. Whether this subgroup will go extinct or adapt is not really certain, but we might be watching the extinction of a culture, essentially. In my opinion, the next technique is equally impressive. In Patagonia, Argentina, there's a small subgroup of orcas that have learned to intentionally beach themselves to hunt seals that are close to the water. They use a wave to both beach themselves, and then they use receding waves to try to wiggle back to the ocean after their hunt. It is believed that only 25 orcas are capable of doing this method, so it is the most unique and also rare form of hunting for orcas. Mothers try to teach this technique to their young by sort of pushing them onto the land and then sticking around to be able to pull them back in the water if something goes wrong. But of course, this is a very difficult technique, which is why there's only a few orcas that have mastered it. There's also orcas that eat great white sharks, because why not? The most famous example of this are the half-brothers called Port and Starboard. They're likely responsible for the disappearance of the great white shark in False Bay, South Africa. They were seen preying on sharks for a few weeks, and then the sharks just completely disappeared. Firstly, because a lot of them were eaten, and secondly, sharks flee their hunting grounds for several years if they even see an orca, because they're so terrified of them. And for good reasons. The way orcas hunt sharks is by using a combination of repeatedly ramming into them and using karate chops with their tails to disorientate the shark. And now comes the crazy part. As if they had an understanding of the shark's biology, they flip the shark around, which causes tonic immobility, where they're completely defenseless. And then these picky bastards only eat the livers. But it kind of makes sense because sharks' liver make up 25% of their overall body weight, and they also contain one of the calorie densest oils in the ocean. Orcas that feed on these livers usually don't have to hunt for a few days afterwards. As a quick honorable mention, we have this. Whoop-pow. Yikes. With all of these impressive techniques, you are probably wondering how they communicate with each other to be able to pull off these complex strategies, like the wave washing, for example. For hunting and communicating, they mainly use echolocation. By emitting short, high-frequency sound pulses and interpreting the returning echoes, they can build a precise acoustic picture of their surroundings. This way they can identify different prey and also differentiate between different types of salmon, so that they know if it's their favorite Chinook salmon or a different species, which is very impressive. The clicks pass through the melon, a large fatty organ in the whale's forehead that acts as an acoustic lens, directing the sound waves into a focused beam ahead of them. Orca communication is highly complex, and the sad reality is that we are still a long way from understanding all of their communication. So far, we think that orcas mainly use 3 types of vocalizations: clicks, whistles, and pulsating calls, with the latter being the most commonly used. How much orcas actually vocalize is different from group to group, and it depends on what kind of prey they're hunting. Northeast Pacific resident groups tend to be much more vocal than transient groups in the same waters. This is because residents feed primarily on Chinook salmon, which are not very sensitive to orca calls, and in contrast, the marine mammal prey of transient can hear echolocation, and thus transients are typically silent to avoid the prey hearing them approach. But perhaps the most stunning part of orca communication, and also another clear sign of their very high intelligence, is that they have different dialects. The call patterns and structure are distinctive within the metrolines. Newborns produce calls similar to their mothers, and in the first period of their lives they learn their own dialect depending on the specific metroline. The individuals likely learn the dialect through contact with their own pod members. In the days following a calf's birth, it was observed that the orcas seem to be using the family-specific calls more often, which of course helps the newborn to learn the dialect quicker, which is just smart. I don't know how else to put it. And I wish I could tell you more about the specific calls themselves and in which specific moments they use them to coordinate their hunts, but we're just not there yet when it comes to understanding the specific communications of orcas or animals in general. There are many anecdotes about special interactions between orcas and humans, and I want to talk about some of them now. Firstly, I think it's important to say that there's not one reported case of a wild orca killing a human. Despite being apex predators, they do not view us as prey or target humans for consumption. And thank fuck for that. Can you imagine if orcas actively hunted humans? A recent study compiled 34 cases from the last 2 decades of incidents where orcas offered food for humans. The scientists proposed a few different explanations for why the orcas were doing this, and the answer is probably a combination. The first is reciprocity testing. In the wild, orcas may share food with the expectation of future favors. By offering a gift, they might be exploring whether humans are capable of giving anything back to them. Secondly, sharing food is standard behavior in orca pods. After a successful hunt, orcas usually share their food to help the weak or old and to make sure that all of them are fed. There's even a few examples where orcas share food with disabled orcas in their own pod, which is a sign of strong emotional intelligence. Offering food to humans may simply be an attempt to apply this cultural norm to us. And last but not least is simply play and curiosity. These highly intelligent mammals frequently wait for a human's reaction after offering prey and have been known to persist in offering it if initially refused. This suggests a playful curiosity about how we might react to them offering food to us, which is crazy to think about. But here comes a story that I found even more remarkable than that. I'm talking about the law of the tongue, which is a well-documented case of long-term cooperation between orcas and humans. It describes an unspoken agreement between the indigenous Yuin people and later European whalers and a pod of killer whales in the Twofold Bay near Eden, Australia. The killer whales would track and herd migrating baleen whales into the bay and then signal to the whalers that the catch was ready. To signal to the whalers that they had cornered baleen whales, they used spy hopping, the technique I mentioned earlier, or just breaching, jumping out of the water, or slapping their tails on the water close to the whaling stations. So they knew how to get the attention of the humans, which is so mind-blowing to me. In exchange for their help, the whalers allowed the orcas to feed exclusively on the captured whale's fleshy lips and tongue, which is why this interaction was called the law of the tongue. Once the orcas had eaten their fill, the whalers would harvest the rest of the whale carcass for blubber and oil. The practice was first established by the local Tawa people of the Yuin nation, who viewed the orcas as their reincarnated ancestors and brothers. The alliance was extensively documented by 19th and 20th century European whalers, specifically the Davidson family who ran a shore-based whaling station in Eden. This begs the final question: how intelligent are they actually, and is there a case to be made for orcas being smarter than us? Let's start with the facts here. Orcas have the second biggest brain of all mammals, and their brain to body ratio is also really good, coming in third after dolphins and humans. Their gyrification index, so basically how much the brain is folded to increase surface area, is one of the highest in the world at 5.7. Humans only have 2.2. This gyrification index allows for rapid processing of vast amounts of data, so just in terms of raw processing power, they're definitely ahead of us. And here comes the crazy part. Orcas have a highly developed insular cortex, which is the part of the brain responsible for emotion, compassion, interpersonal relationships, and consciousness. This part of their brain, alongside the paralimbic system, is more complex and more highly developed than it is in humans. So it is entirely within reason to assume that orcas are highly emotional beings and might even surpass us when it comes to emotional capacities. And this can be seen in examples of their behavior as well. There are several reported occasions where orca mothers carry their deceased young with them for weeks and weeks, and this might be a form of grieving, although once again it's very difficult to sort of interpret animal behavior through a human lens, so we can't just say they're grieving, but it seems very plausible. So to answer the question if they are more intelligent than humans, I would say it depends on what you define as intelligence. If we look at it only from an IQ lens, then humans are definitely smarter. So there was one study which, to be fair, I thought was a little bit wobbly, but they found that orcas probably have an IQ of a 15 to 16-year-old, but please take this information with a grain of salt because, like I said, it was one study. And of course there's difficulties in making an orca do an IQ test. And also herein lies the problem of the IQ approach to answering this question. IQ is an entirely human-made concept, so it's not very surprising that we're best at it. Human intelligence is heavily driven by our manipulation of physical objects. Orca's intelligence is predominantly social and spatial, adapted for a completely different environment. Now, if orcas have such massive and complex brains and are as intelligent as many are claiming, why haven't they built societies? The answer has to do with anatomy and environment. Orcas lack opposable thumbs and live in aquatic environments where fire cannot be harnessed. And if you know anything about human evolution, you know that we wouldn't have gotten very far without harnessing fire. So for orcas, without the ability to manipulate materials to create external storage for knowledge, like writing, books, or digital data, their intelligence is entirely internalized and passed down orally and behaviorally. Therefore, while humans exceed at technological and manipulative intelligence, orcas may very well match or even surpass us in social, emotional, and ecological intelligence. Because if you ask me, destroying the environment which granted you life in the first place is not a sign of very high intelligence, and humans aren't doing too hot on that one. Arguably, a true measure of intelligence is thriving in an environment without destroying it. In contrast to humanity's history of environmental destructions, orcas have lived sustainably in balance with the ocean for millions of years. One quick little side note, I think it's absolutely diabolical that we are keeping these so obviously very intelligent and sentient beings in captivity just for them to do little shows for us. So please, for the love of God, don't go to places like SeaWorld or any other place that keeps orcas in captivity. They're kept in super small pools where they often have to remain still the whole night, and sometimes they even group orcas from different ecotypes together, and as you now know, they have different dialects, so they can't even communicate, which leads to conflicts and also incidents where orcas attack humans. But that only happens in captivity, so maybe just don't fucking lock them up. Yeah, I think that's it for today. And if you've enjoyed this video, feel free to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. And yeah, I'll see you in the next one. Peace out.